In Imo State, there was a girl they called Chi Barbie, and that name carried more trouble than anyone expected. Now, let me start this story properly, because if I don't, some of you will think I'm exaggerating. In that village in Imo State, people had seen many things: bad roads, stubborn goats, men who promised marriage and disappeared, but pink hair that touched the ground? No, that one was new. At first, everybody thought it was a joke. Some even said the rain would wash the color away. It didn't. The hair stayed, and so did the attention. Nobody feared her at first, and that was the honest truth, because fear does not usually arrive dressed in beauty or confidence. And in that part of Imo State, where people believed they had seen enough surprises to last a lifetime, laughter came easier than caution. Before the village ever called her Chi Barbie, they laughed, they whispered, and some even clapped in disbelief, because pink hair that touched the ground was not something their fathers had warned them about, nor something their mothers had prepared advice for. And when she first walked through the dusty road with that hair trailing behind her like it belonged to another world, people stood still, not out of respect, but out of confusion. At first, many thought it was a joke that would end with the next rain, and a few elders even said the sun would soon correct her, because in villages, the sun is believed to humble everything eventually. But the hair stayed, the color remained bold, and Chi Barbie herself did not shrink under attention the way people expected her to. She dressed differently too, not carelessly and not improperly, but deliberately, with thicker fabrics, fitted shapes, and colors that announced her presence long before her footsteps did. And in a place where women were taught to blend into the background of daily life, her refusal to disappear felt like entertainment at first. Someone opened a small hair shop near the road and said it was hers, and people went there not because they believed anything special would happen, but because curiosity has always been cheaper than wisdom. Women sat on the wooden benches laughing, gossiping, adjusting their wrappers, and watching her hands move. And when they left, they did not only leave with braided hair that reached farther down their backs than usual, they left with a posture that felt unfamiliar, as though something had shifted quietly inside them. Some husbands noticed it first, though they did not say much, only that their wives spoke differently that evening, with firmer voices and fewer apologies. And because no one likes to be the first to sound suspicious, the village laughed it off. Chi Barbie lived with her father, a man who had seen enough of life to know that attention never arrives without appetite. And though he did not scold her, he watched her more closely than before, especially when women started arriving at the shop earlier than necessary, waiting even before the stools were arranged, as if sitting near her mattered more than the hairstyle itself. Apprentices gathered around her too, young women eager to learn, copying not only her braiding patterns, but her walk, her silence, the way she looked people in the eye without lowering her head. And when they called her Madame, half in jest and half in reverence, something in the air shifted, though no one could yet name it. The laughter did not stop immediately, but it changed shape, because jokes began to carry questions inside them, and whispers started stretching longer than humor should allow. A woman argued with her husband the same night she returned from Chi Barbie's shop. Not violently, not loudly, but firmly enough that neighbors noticed, and an apprentice snapped at her mother in a way that felt new, impatient, and unfamiliar. And though these were small things, villages have long memories for patterns, even when they pretend not to. Chi Barbie herself did not seem bothered. She moved through the village with ease, greeting some, ignoring others, her hair sweeping the ground behind her like it was entitled to space. And though people still laughed when she passed, they now watched too, because laughter that is mixed with attention slowly forgets how to remain harmless. Her father warned her one evening without raising his voice, telling her that people were beginning to look too closely, and she smiled the way confident people smile, when they believe attention is proof of success rather than the beginning of scrutiny. What no one said aloud, not even those who sensed it, was that something about her shop felt heavier than hair and mirrors and chatter, as though something had settled there quietly and decided to stay. And by the time the laughter softened into watchfulness, Chi Barbie had already become a name people repeated more carefully than before. Not because they feared her yet, but because in villages, the moment people stop laughing freely is often the moment a story begins to change direction. And that was how it started. Not with curses or warnings, but with amusement that lingered too long, with beauty that refused to fade, and with a confidence that did not yet know it was being counted. By the time the village realized that Chi Barbie's shop was no longer just a place where hair was braided, it had already become something else, something quieter and more influential, because people no longer went there only when their hair needed attention. They went there when they needed to feel seen. And that difference, though subtle, carried weight. Women arrived from neighboring villages across Imo State, some walking long distances, others coming early enough to sit outside before the shop even opened. And when asked why they could not simply go elsewhere, they shrugged and said Chi Barbie's hands understood things other hands did not. Inside the shop, there was nothing dramatic to point at. No loud music, no strange symbols, no obvious display of power. Just wooden stools, mirrors that reflected more than faces, and Chi Barbie standing calmly as she worked, her long pink hair gathered carefully away from her hands, her fingers moving with patience and confidence. She spoke less than most hairstylists, listened more than expected, and when she did speak, her words settled gently but firmly, as if they had already decided where they belonged. And women left not only with longer, fuller braids, but with expressions that suggested they had made up their minds about things they had not been brave enough to name before. It became common to hear people say that Chi Barbie transformed women, and though the word was used lightly at first, it began to sit heavier with repetition, because transformation does not always announce itself with celebration. Some women began to dress differently after visiting her shop, adjusting their wrappers, lifting their chins, taking longer glances at themselves before leaving home. And while this might have been harmless on its own, the village noticed that patience was thinning in small ways, conversations growing sharper, silences becoming less obedient, and though no one accused Chi Barbie of causing it, her name hovered near every observation. Her apprentices watched everything closely, learning the craft with hunger and admiration. And they changed too, not overnight but steadily, copying the way she walked through the village without apology, the way she dressed with intention, and the way she carried herself as though the ground beneath her feet had already accepted her presence. Some of them followed her into the city at night, and when they returned, they brought back stories that felt larger than the village could comfortably hold. Stories of parties, laughter, and places where nobody asked them to lower their voices. And while nothing about these outings could be called wrong, the confidence they returned with unsettled people who believed that ambition should grow slowly and quietly. Chi Barbie's father noticed the change before most others did, not because he feared her success, but because he understood villages well enough to know when attention begins to sharpen its teeth. He watched as chairs in her shop filled faster than before, as mirrors grew crowded with faces lingering longer than necessary, and as young women began taking advice from her that had nothing to do with hair, advice about patience, choice, and the idea that life could be shaped deliberately rather than endured. And though he said little, his concern settled heavily in the corners of his silence. Meanwhile, the elders began to observe without comment, which in that village meant more than loud disagreement ever could, because elders rarely speak when they are still counting. They noticed patterns forming, noticed how often Chi Barbie's name appeared in conversations that had nothing to do with beauty, noticed how quickly admiration was becoming influence, and though they did not accuse her of anything, they began to wonder whether a shop that reshaped people so effectively might be doing more than its walls could contain. What troubled the village most was not that women were becoming beautiful, because beauty had always existed among them, but that something in the air felt unsettled, as though confidence was being harvested too efficiently and ambition was being stirred without direction. Small disagreements grew louder, homes felt tighter, and though none of these things could be traced directly to Chi Barbie's hands, the timing was too precise to ignore entirely, even if ignoring it felt safer. And so the shop remained busy, laughter still floated through its doorway, and Chi Barbie continued walking with the same calm certainty as before. But beneath the surface of admiration, a quiet question had begun to form in the village, one that no one was yet ready to ask aloud, about how much influence one person should be allowed to hold before attention turns into responsibility. By the time that question began to take shape, the village was already watching more carefully, and Chi Barbie, surrounded by mirrors and praise, had not yet realized that observation, once it deepens, rarely arrives without consequence. It was easy for the village to believe that Chi Barbie's influence ended when the sun went down, because during the day she was visible, approachable and familiar, standing in her shop with mirrors and stools and chatter like any other woman earning her living. But the truth was that night had always been part of her life, long before the village learned how to say her name carefully. Long before her grandmother died, Chi Barbie had already learned that some gatherings were not meant to be explained, only attended, and that knowledge, once inherited, does not loosen its grip easily. Her grandmother had been a quiet woman, the sort people respected without fully understanding why, and when she passed, the village mourned politely and moved on, never knowing that Chi Barbie had already been part of what the old woman left behind. The coven did not announce itself, did not recruit loudly, and did not seek approval because it existed in agreement rather than display, and they met only at night, not because darkness hid them, but because night does not interrupt the way daylight does. Chi Barbie attended these gatherings regularly, leaving her house after her father had gone to sleep, returning before dawn with a stillness that lingered longer than rest. No one in the village ever saw what happened during those nights, and no one ever heard a full account of what was said, but the effects were easier to notice than the acts themselves. Chi Barbie slept less than before, waking earlier than necessary, moving through her days with a calm that felt sharpened, as though her thoughts had learned to line up more efficiently. Her patience grew thinner in some places and deeper in others, and though she never complained openly, there were moments when her eyes carried the weight of obligations that admiration alone could not explain. The coven did not give her beauty, and they did not teach her how to braid hair better than others, because those things had already been hers, but what they refined was her understanding of attention, how it moves, how it settles, and how it feeds on repetition. They reminded her that admiration is a resource, and like all resources, it demands care, boundaries, and loyalty. And each night she attended, the unspoken expectation of her presence grew heavier, until absence no longer felt optional. By day, her shop reflected the changes. Customers arrived with urgency, apprentices waited with eagerness that bordered on restlessness, and the mirrors seemed to hold more than reflections, as though people lingered there not to admire their hair, but to confirm something about themselves. Chi Barbie walked with steady hands, but her silences lengthened, and when she spoke, her words landed more firmly than before, guiding conversations away from doubt and toward certainty. And though no one could accuse her of wrongdoing, the influence she carried began to feel deliberate rather than accidental. Her father noticed the nights first, noticing how often she returned before dawn, how little she spoke about where she had been, and how her distance grew quietly, not through rebellion but through focus. And one evening he asked her, carefully, whether everything she was building still belonged to her. She laughed softly, told him not to worry, and reminded him that success always looks strange before it becomes familiar. But his concern did not fade because he had lived long enough to know that some paths become narrower the further you walk them. Meanwhile, the village's observation deepened. Elders compared notes without meeting, noticing how often Chi Barbie's name surfaced in conversations about disagreement, ambition, and restlessness. And though none of these things were crimes, their accumulation unsettled those who believed that balance should not tilt so quickly in one direction.
They did not speak publicly because Igbo land values patience over panic, but they began to watch her father's compound more closely, understanding that influence rarely travels alone. Chi Barbie, surrounded by admiration and obligation, did not yet feel trapped, but she felt needed. And need, when it grows quietly, has a way of disguising itself as purpose. Each night she attended the gatherings, believing she was strengthening what she had built, and each morning she returned to a shop that felt more demanding than before. And though she did not yet realize it, the space between her and the village was beginning to shift, not outward but inward, tightening slowly like a hand closing around something it does not intend to release. By the time the elders decided it was time to speak, Chi Barbie's life had already divided itself into two halves, day and night, admiration and obligation, and the balance she believed she controlled was already leaning toward a weight she had underestimated. In Igbo land, laws do not always announce themselves with writing or punishment, and some are older than memory itself, resting quietly in custom, timing, and restraint, known by everyone and broken only by those who believe that familiarity can soften consequence. Chi Barbie knew these laws as well as anyone else because she had grown up watching them observed without question. Days when work slowed deliberately, moments when certain actions were postponed out of respect rather than fear. And though these rules were rarely spoken aloud, they were carried carefully from one generation to the next like fragile things. The day Chi Barbie chose to ignore one of these boundaries did not begin with defiance, but with confidence, because confidence often disguises itself as practicality. Her shop was busy, customers had arrived early, and apprentices were already seated waiting for instruction. And when someone mentioned that the day was not meant for such work, Chi Barbie hesitated only briefly before dismissing the concern with a smile, reminding them that hair does not understand calendars and that success does not wait for permission. No one argued with her, because by then her certainty had learned how to quiet doubt efficiently. Word spread quickly, not because people wanted trouble, but because villages carry information the way rivers carry leaves, without intention yet with accuracy. And by midday, elders knew that Chi Barbie's shop had remained open on a day meant for restraint. They did not rush to confront her, and they did not send messengers filled with anger, because in their experience, rushing only feeds pride, and pride, once fed, grows stubborn. Instead, they chose a quieter response, one that felt heavier precisely because it lacked noise. That evening, the elders visited her father. They did not accuse him and they did not raise their voices, but they spoke carefully, reminding him that some lines exist not to be tested but to be respected. And though they acknowledged her daughter's skill and influence, they warned that admiration does not grant exemption. Her father listened in silence, absorbing the weight of words he had already feared were coming. And when they left, the space they occupied lingered longer than their presence, settling heavily into the corners of the compound. Chi Barbie did not react immediately. When her father told her what had happened, she laughed softly, not mockingly, but with the assurance of someone who believes that results justify methods. And she insisted that nothing would come of it, that the village needed her more than it admitted, and that people who depended on her shop would not abandon it over something so small. Her confidence, sharpened by nights of obligation and days of praise, did not allow room for caution, and she returned to her routines believing the matter settled. But villages rarely respond with confrontation when silence will do more damage. The next morning, her shop opened as usual, stools arranged, mirrors wiped clean, braiding tools laid out carefully. Yet something felt different, because the first customer did not arrive on time. Then the second failed to appear. Apprentices trickled in slowly, some with excuses, others with lowered eyes, and by midday, chairs that were once never empty remained untouched, their emptiness louder than any accusation could have been. Chi Barbie waited, confident that the absence was temporary, but by evening, the quiet had begun to feel deliberate, and for the first time since her shop gained influence, she felt the discomfort of attention withdrawing. No announcement had been made, no punishment declared. The village had simply adjusted. An adjustment, when shared silently, has a way of spreading faster than rebellion ever could. That night, Chi Barbie attended the gathering with a new unease settling into her thoughts, expecting reassurance or guidance, but instead finding only reminders of obligation, of balance, of costs that increase when boundaries are ignored. And though she returned before dawn, as she always did, the calm she once carried felt heavier, less certain, as though something had shifted beneath her confidence without asking for permission. By the time she opened her shop again the following day, Chi Barbie was beginning to understand that laws broken quietly are often answered quietly too, and that influence, once challenged, does not always collapse loudly, but prefers to fade in ways that leave no one to confront and nothing to undo. Silence is often mistaken for forgiveness, but in villages, silence usually means a decision has already been made, and Chi Barbie began to understand this only after the quiet stretched longer than patience should allow. Days passed, and her shop remained open, stools arranged neatly each morning, mirrors wiped until they shone, yet people walked past without slowing their steps, greeting her politely if they must, but no longer entering, as though the space itself had been gently removed from their daily path. Apprentices stopped coming one by one, some offering excuses, others offering none at all. And though Chi Barbie told herself that this was only a phase, that admiration would return once people remembered what they gained from her hands, she could not ignore how quickly absence had replaced devotion. The confidence she once wore easily now felt heavier, less responsive, and the rituals that once sharpened her influence no longer answered with the same certainty because obligation, once relied upon too often, eventually stops pretending to be support. Her father felt the change as deeply as she did, perhaps more, because the village did not approach Chi Barbie directly, but they watched his compound differently now, greeting him with caution instead of warmth, pausing conversations when he drew near. And though no one accused him openly, he understood that living under one roof meant sharing both reputation and consequence. At night, he sat longer in silence, and Chi Barbie, for the first time, noticed how much her choices had begun to echo beyond herself. She attended the gatherings less confidently, listening more than she spoke, realizing too late that what she believed she controlled had quietly begun to count her attendance rather than respond to her needs. The coven did not punish her, and they did not rescue her either, because power borrowed from agreement does not intervene when balance is broken. It only withdraws its enthusiasm and leaves the borrower to manage what remains. In the village, life continued as it always does, because communities are skilled at adjusting without ceremony. New shops gained attention, old routines returned, and slowly, Chi Barbie's name stopped appearing in conversations about admiration and began surfacing instead as a caution, mentioned softly when elders spoke about restraint, about timing, about knowing when influence has grown large enough to require humility. One afternoon, Chi Barbie sat alone in her shop, her long pink hair braided carefully, falling just as beautifully as it always had. But this time, there was no audience, no mirror crowded with faces seeking permission to change, only the sound of passing footsteps that did not stop. For the first time, she understood that beauty does not disappear when attention leaves, but power does, and it rarely explains why it is going. The story did not end with her exile, nor with public shame, but with awareness, the kind that arrives too late to reverse choices, but early enough to teach others. And the village carried that lesson forward quietly, understanding that influence is not measured by how many people gather around you, but by how carefully you respect the boundaries that allow a community to remain whole. If you are in her place, would you have noticed the warning in time? If this story made you pause, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that quiet lessons are the hardest to ignore.